YouTube and make sure everything sounds correct. Hopefully it does. We're going to find out. I think we're good. Is this good? Mm-hmm. I think it's good. All right. Okay, I'm just going to share this broadcast on Twitter, and then we will get going. So, without much more delay, we are soon to begin. Okay, just a sec. Almost there. Here we go. All right. And it looks like we are up and running. So, welcome. Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to yet another episode of UnShrink Me. For those of you who are brand new, I am Dr. Patrick Lockwood, a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. But for the purpose of this podcast, please don't sue me or whatever, so I'm just Patrick here. So if you're new, welcome to the podcast. This is a weekly podcast about you, the consumers of mental health services, whether that's through psychiatry, psychology, couples therapy, counseling, coaching, whatever you're doing to change the way your mind works in the world. I am here to give you feedback and here to support you in your process. So I am not here specifically supporting any particular individual who listens. So this is not psychological advice to you. This is me rambling into a microphone, trying to hopefully have a dialogue with the people who show up in the YouTube comments and the chats. But the main idea of this podcast is to provide high-level takes and views on things related to mental health and the management of the mind more effectively, because there's a lot of woo out there. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of garbage in the pop psychology world. So this is my attempt, hopefully sometimes being funny, sometimes being helpful, trying to help everyone navigate their mental health services more effectively. So this is what UnShrink Me is. It is my weekly podcast here on the Psychology Checkup, which is my YouTube channel. So please like, share, and subscribe. Help me get the word out. Let's get more people in the conversation about a more accurate and realistic view of mental health and its management. Good afternoon, Corey. Glad you're here. So for those of you who are brand new, you will often hear me say hello or talk to somebody in the chat because I am trying to watch the screen and be involved in a dialogue with the people who give their time and come chat. So, Jonathan Cogburn, hello, sir. Good to see you. A lot of interesting people come to chat, and it is so gratifying to have people come hang out and chat with me and share ideas and refine ideas together so that if you're out there and you're seeking counseling, therapy, coaching, whatever, you can get the most out of your services that you're seeking. So again, this is not specific advice to any individual. This is just me giving broad ideas and broad feedback that may or may not inform what you do. So today's podcast, we're going to talk about some trendy things that always show up and for some reason do not go away. And we're also going to talk about some niche things. So I'll try to make sure that the niche things are as appropriate and broadly understandable as possible, all things considered. And if you are brand new, I'll be pulling information and content from my Twitter/X profile. And so if you're brand new, please join and follow along on Twitter or X. My handle is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. And if you're brand new, always know that this podcast is fueled by Celsius. Now, it's fueled by Celsius. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is sponsored by Celsius. Maybe in some future episode that will be the case, but this is at least fueled by Celsius. Not an official sponsor, at least at this point. Because that's good stuff. It tastes good, gives me some energy, some vitality. All right, so we have some interesting stuff to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. We're also going to talk about the difference between being a clinician and a barista, which sounds like an absurd topic, but please let me explain and do what I can to say why that might matter to us. We're also going to talk about what does it mean to have a mental disorder versus ordinary pathology or ordinary distress and suffering. Because there's ordinary suffering and then there's actual disorders. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our buddy Nick Tabor from Twitter, who talks about the problem of therapy trying to remove people's defenses. So I think that's a really good topic, and I want to make sure that we give Nick his proper due because Nick is a friend of the show. So those are our 4 basic topics, and I really love the 4 people I'm going to talk about today, or the 3 people specifically I'm going to talk about today. So, and Jake Moss is here in the chat. He says, looking forward to your thoughts on Mel. Equally, I'm a follower of Jordanticus. I'm an OCD therapist, and his tweets have me worried about how he is working with clients. Well, Jake, I'm not here to necessarily call people out. I am here to just talk about the things that make sense to me, and to whatever extent they disagree with these people or agree with these people, it is not a personal attack on them. Although personal attacks are fun, and I just wish more people would attack me, it does not appear to be the case that that is useful from my perspective. So, we'll see what happens, and maybe I'll get a little feisty and say some off-the-cuff things that are not so friendly, but I don't think that's my intention so far, but maybe with enough Celsius, that will change. We will see. So let's start with Nick Tabor first, because our buddy Nick, friend of the show, and that's a phrase I've stolen from Tim Dillon, admittedly, so thank you, Tim Dillon, for a couple of euphemisms I can borrow and mess around with, because I do consider myself, for those of you who don't know, I do consider myself the Tim Dillon of Psychology and Therapy podcast, which probably means all sorts of bad stuff for all of you in the comments who are watching and listening, but that's supposed to be a joke. I don't know if it landed. We'll find out. Lots of gratitude to Tim Dillon for helping me refine my rant skills. So, okay. Anyways, Nick Tabor is the first person I'd like to talk about, and here's a hot take of his that I'd like to have a hot take about. So, Nick is, Jake says, we like off the cuff. Yes, we do. We're ramping up the Celsius throughout the entire podcast. So Nick Tabor, for those of you who don't know, Nick Tabor is, I think, broadly speaking, considered a part of the critical psychiatry, anti-psychiatry crowd. And so I like him. I appreciate him. I respect some of the things that he says. I disagree with many of the things that he says, but I have a basic respect for who he is and what he's trying to do. Excuse me. And so here's what he said on July 20th. So this is slightly older. I didn't get to it as quickly as I'd like to. So I'm going to repost this right now so you can all see it. Again, my handle on Twitter is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. Okay, here we go. So on July 20th, Nick said the following. And his handle, by the way, if you want to follow Nick, is at NICKTABER. So here's what Nick said on July 20th. The psychotherapy profession today very often characterizes people's protective, defensive, and territorial instincts as pathological, subtly shaming them into weakening their boundaries. This strips away the density required to stand up against relational or systemic parasitism. So he is very good at speaking in a very complicated way. And so I'm just going to tell you what I think he means. This is my interpretation of what he means, and then let me disagree with it and see if you disagree with my interpretation. So the first sentence is a rather long sentence, and he is famous for this. The psychotherapy profession today very often characterizes people's protective, defensive, and territorial instincts as pathological, subtly shaming them into weakening their boundaries. So what I take that to mean is that the therapy profession, broadly speaking, wants people to not be so defensive. And I think that's a very interesting hot take, because I think that depending upon how you're trained, you will see the concept of defenses very differently. And then his second sentence is equally important. This strips away the density required to stand up against relational or systemic parasitism. So I once had a little bit of a back and forth with Eric Weinstein, and I think this was a private conversation, but I don't think I'm going to say anything weird or proprietary, or maybe it was in DMs or something. I don't remember. Or maybe I just heard him talking. I don't know. But I believe this was actually in our conversation one time. And we were talking about the necessity of defenses, or maybe this was a tweet of his. So I did have a private conversation with him once, but this isn't actually from that private conversation. Roll that back. So I take that back. But he talked about the importance of defenses. And so Eric Weinstein's not a therapist, a psychologist, a shrink. He is a mathematician who does physics and, all these things. And so I respect him because he's a thinker. He's a critical thinker, and he is friends with people in the psychology world that are up there. And so his take was defenses are important because being vulnerable makes no freaking sense. It's absolutely weird that we should be quote unquote vulnerable all day, and you should be brave by being vulnerable, and crap like that is kind of my version of what he was saying. And I agree with the basic premise that it makes no sense, as Nick Tabor is saying, that therapists should help people become unnecessarily vulnerable or unnecessarily open or open to being attacked or something. I just can't imagine the game theory of that, so to speak. That doesn't make any sense to me. Also, if you're trained psychodynamically or psychoanalytically, and I'll talk more about Mel here in a little bit, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to try to encourage people to be defenseless, because that means you understand nothing about how the mind works. It is impossible to live and not go insane when you don't have defense mechanisms. We all have them and we all need them. The real question becomes, which defense mechanisms should we have and use? Which ones are more quote unquote primitive, if we're going to talk about it that way, and which ones are more adaptive across a wide array of contexts. So sometimes the defense of humor is very useful, but there's also the same thing as being too funny too often. I think many people literally use humor way too much, and they're miserable because of it. I think, unfortunately, part of Robin Williams' struggles in his life, I believe, from what I've heard, is he did too much to make people laugh and could never tolerate the suffering he was experiencing. And so there's a lot of people out there who are very funny, admittedly, but they're also very miserable. And so if you'd like to be less miserable, maybe use the defense mechanism of humor a little bit less. So I hope, dear Nick Tabor, that most therapists understand that some defenses are necessary because it's A, crazy making to be defenseless, and B, not safe, so to speak, to walk around all day being some perfectly open Buddhist monk type, especially in a Western world. That makes no sense to me. So let's see what the comments in the chats here say. Jonathan Cogbert says, I love that I can always talk to Nick in spite of a few significant disagreements. Me too. He seems like an honest critic, and we need accountability from non-clinical thinkers. Agree. Megan, psychobabble? What's psychobabble? Tell me what's psychobabble. Corey Grad, it sounds like Nick views therapy as hollowing out the client like a jack-o'-lantern. Probably he does, Corey, and I think maybe he has been hollowed out by professionals in his life before. So I have some sympathy and some respect for that. Corey said so Seth says, hello, here for the hot takes. I'm glad you're here. And he says, with respect to Tabor, I'm seeing the critiques become empty. Zero context, zero attempt to assume anything other than the most evil intention. It's probably the truth that many of Nick's takes are a little on the superficial side. Not in the sense that he is fully wrong or something, just in the sense that, he generally he's kind of one-dimensional because he has one axe to grind. And so the people with one axe to grind serve a purpose in the ecosystem that is mental health, broadly speaking. I think it's a question just of, if you have one axe to grind and you're not willing to be more well-rounded or to look at multiple perspectives, then what's the game theory of that? Because it seems to me like, genuinely speaking, most people are more complicated. Professionals are complicated. I think there are some professionals who really want people to be vulnerable all the time, and they're idiots. And there's a lot of idiots out there in the profession. I don't think that's the majority of professionals. I think most people recognize that some defensiveness is normal, and we need some to stay psychologically stable, because stable is more important than radically open, essentially. In my opinion, at least. Megan says, I like Nick, but this take in particular was reaching and trying too hard. Well, yeah, I think he's reaching and trying too hard, but I think the problem with Nick is that, again, because of his experiences, my guess, to the extent that I understand him, not trying to do mind reading, just trying to share what I believe I know. My guess is that Nick probably has this axe to grind, and this is the niche role that he serves, essentially. This is his thing that he's trying to do. And so it would be weird if he was trying to do what I'm trying to do, for instance. I don't know that he would look this good in the jacket, by the way. So genuinely speaking, I think Nick serves a useful purpose, and that's why I always want to give him a shout out. Also, I want us to be able to pick apart what he says so that we can come to a more nuanced understanding of things, and that's what I'm trying to do here. So I always thank Nick for the grist for the mill. So the average therapist might not think too deeply about defense mechanisms. That being said, if you talk about kids, because that's one of his favorite topics is kids being harmed by the mental health system, I'm sure there are plenty of child therapists. I am almost 100% certain there's so many child therapists who see developing personality and developing defense mechanisms as all pathology, which is not true. But there's a lot of really, really unnuanced people. And so there's a lot of mediocre clinicians. And I think that is the bigger problem, is that we have mediocre clinicians who don't look at the mind as this dynamic organism, this ecosystem like I talk about it, and see the utility of defense mechanisms and how they're balancing things out. That is the problem. And that leads me, by the way, directly into my comment about Mel's post. So Mel is coming up next, just to be clear. But just to get back to the chat here. One of the problems, Corey Grad says, one of the problems with these types of conversations is there are some therapists out there who do these things, and all it takes is one bad therapist to really fuck someone up, which is true. So, excuse me, what Corey just said is 100% true. There are bad therapists, and they do screw people up and hurt people, and that can give all of us a bad rap. And fair enough, because we should all be very mindful of how we view the mind. We should all be like, are my assumptions based upon my countertransference? Are my assumptions about how the mind works actually grounded in what we know about how the brain works? We should be very critical of what we believe to be true, because most of us just have reflexive assumptions that are based on outdated research about psychology and the brain. So it's very important to be skeptical, which is why I appreciate Nick as a countervailing force, as a loud voice against the orthodoxy of mainstream mental health per se. That being said, I don't believe he's correct often, and he is oversimplified like Megan is saying. Megan says, critique of psychology can turn into its own psychobabble. Yeah, sure, sometimes. There's so much psychobabble. There's so many people who are full of psychobabble, and that's why I try not to do that on this podcast as much as I can. So, that is enough, my friends, about Nick Tabor. So, dear Nick Tabor, thank you as always for the grist, for the mill, to get things jumping and going, which leads me into Mel. And so, I don't know this person's full name or anything, and so I am not trying to engage in particular drama, just to be clear about what I believe consciously my intentions are. So let me retweet this real quick, and then I'll explain what I believe my intentions are and what I believe I'm trying to accomplish here. And you can tell me how reasonable I'm being or not. Please don't be shy. Please be extra critical in case I am full of myself. Okay, so about 5 days ago, sometimes people retweet this person, and I'm blocked. So just backdrop, I got blocked for saying something. I don't know what I said. I'm not upset. I'm just annoying to this person, and that's totally okay. And I'm certainly happy to be blocked if I am making this person less miserable. That's fine by me. I know that I'm annoying to some people. Totally fine. So this person, the handle is the Meljar. That's her name, I think. And the handle is at THE_Mel, MEL at _JAR. So the Meljar is someone who practices depth-oriented psychotherapy. I don't know that she would call herself a psychoanalyst per se, But, she tweets these very, very long things about analytic ideas and movies and books and thoughts and quotes. And I believe this person's extremely smart and very thoughtful. I also believe this person, like all of us in therapy land, the world's worst theme park, are kind of weird and messed up, like myself, which I've explained at length in this podcast. And so here's what Mel said, and I'm not going to read everything she wrote because she writes insanely large, long threads that I don't have the patience to read most of the time. Now, I want to back the truck up here too. So this is a post about, people criticizing therapists for not being very smart. So as a professor, as someone who teaches future therapists and spends about a third of my life doing that, this matters to me because if I don't care about the quality of the people I am partially responsible for producing as a professor, then I am fucked as a professional. There's something wrong with me, I think. I don't care enough is part of the problem. So this is very personal, to be clear. Not that I think Mel is attacking me or something. I don't think this post is about me at all. I don't think she's like subtweeting me or something. I just think that this is extremely important to me, and I think everyone who is out there seeking therapy should understand the kind of professional that they're sitting across from and how helpful they can be based upon how they were trained and how smart they are. So, and there's a number of comments I want to get to in the chat, but before I get to those comments, I really want to be very clear that this is not me attacking Mel. This is me addressing a particular idea that I think is a problem because it is softening accountability in the profession specifically. And I believe what she's doing it for the correct reasons, and she has well-justified reasons, but I think it is not the correct approach, personally. Because of what I do as a professor, I think this is actually the wrong approach. So here's what she said, I think, on August 3rd. And I think I responded the same day. So here are her exact words. The other issue, here's what she said. The other issue about the quote-unquote most therapists or midwits who are mediocre at their jobs thing, which I have said before in this podcast, in the parlance of this website, is that this just so happens to be true of most people in jobs, or of most people, period, including the jobs of parenting and internet posting, which I completely agree with her. This first point is 100% correct. Most people are mediocre. Most people are in the middle in that first standard deviation of things. Here's her second post under this long thread. I mean, precious few of us achieve greatness in any of these important jobs due to this mediocrity called being human. My first point of disagreement. So those of us who have achieved greatness in one of these positions deserve all the respect and praise. We need not be very good at modesty, of course. Okay, so let me talk about where I disagree. Because here's what I said. Here was my tweet. Here was my post 5 days ago. What I said was, and I quote, one important difference between being a clinician and a barista, for instance, is that if my barista, who is often kind of hot and a midwit, they can do their essential task fine enough. There's no harm. Hot baristas make okay drinks. Excuse me. If your clinician is too stupid to understand their bias or their baggage or their countertransference, or that those things even matter, people will not be helped, which could be wasted time. And or therapy will take longer than is needed, which means you're going to financially harm people. And so people who have midwit therapists are, as I said, often harmed via neglect. And thanks to the person who showed me this post. So here's what I will say. I do agree with Mel's original point that it is true that most people are average. I know that I myself am average in a variety of ways, and I'm above average in some other ways. And I'm fine with, I can accept the ways in which I'm average and the ways in which I'm not average. My hope, is that with time, some of the things that I'm kind of average at, I can do better. Darren, hello, good evening. Glad you're here. Here's the deal. I completely accept and acknowledge that average is life. Most people are in that 66% of whatever the first standard deviation is. Fine, or 68%. And so it is literally the case that she is correct in her first post. Now, the problem is that if your therapist is average, let's say they're of average intellect, which means their IQ is around 100, maybe 110, or more problematically, around 90. And some of the people who come to my classes and some of the people that I've met in the profession are clearly IQ around 90 kind of people. And maybe this is going to get me canceled, blah, 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 blah. You don't have to be smart to be a good therapist. Let's be perfectly clear about this. Some people who are not super smart are better listeners, and they're more aware of their baggage because they've touched the stove, or they're sober and they realize their problems. There's so many iterations of different types of people who can be great clinicians. Being smart can help. Being smart can hurt because people can intellectualize and be narcissists and stuff, and that's bad too. So I'm not saying that intelligence is the only kind of quote-unquote mid-wit problem. But imagine you're average with regard to your self-awareness. You can be average with regard to intelligence. That could be both good and bad. Often is more bad than good. But you can also be average with regard to your self-awareness. And so some of that comes down to intellect and trait openness and stuff. And some of that comes down to parents and childhood shit and mental illness. And some of that comes down to how good your mentors are, which I take very seriously because I do this for a living. So I have a buy-in and a bias. So what I will tell you is that I hope you don't have an average therapist. I hope you have an above average therapist in some way. I hope they're above average in the sense that they've done some profound personal work and they understand themselves enough to be clear, like, oh, this is my baggage. I'm not going to let it interfere with my therapy with you. That is what I hope. And that is actually an above average therapist, because the average person is only loosely paying attention to what we call countertransference, where our stuff shows up in session and pushes and pulls us in response to the patient. So I do not agree that an average barista is equally as harmless as an average therapist. I think an average therapist is more harmful than an average barista is. And to me, what I believe to be true is that you don't have to do insane amounts of work or be a super genius to be an above average therapist. I think you can be an above average therapist by being aware when you have strong reactions or even moderate reactions to people, or the opposite, when you have no reactions to people. That means something about you too. Being aware that your knowledge base is old and outdated. Those two things that I just stated are like super straightforward. And I can say them in grad school to my students and they'll get it right away. Now you take a practicing therapist who thinks they're smart, that is a problem. You know what I mean? Because they are comfortable in their level of knowledge. So I actually worry myself way more about practicing therapists than I worry about grad students who have, mentors like myself and my colleagues. I love my colleagues. I think they're doing really good work. So, I think with full respect to Mel, I agree with the first point, which is average is normal. And that's true for all of us. I also disagree that an average therapist is equally harmless compared to your average barista or something like that, because as I said, your average therapist might be wasting your time, might be wasting your money. And not everyone has money to burn. Not everyone has time to burn, So I think it's very, very important to not be an average therapist. And so here's some hot tips to be an above average therapist. Hot tip number 1, learn as much as you can about yourself and what your baggage might be, what your trauma, your shame, your childhood stuff, your cultural differences, your personality differences, your intellectual differences. Learn about all those differences and how they shape the way you show up with people. The more you understand yourself as the instrument of therapy, per se, in the relationship, then the more you can help people, often more quickly in some ways, which means you waste less time and money with people. That doesn't mean you can always shortcut therapy or some crap like that. I'm not even saying that's a good goal. I'm just saying that to the extent that we play a role, 50% in therapy, if we do our part correctly, then we don't hold people back. So that's why I think being an average therapist is a bad idea. And so hot tip number 1, learn as much as you can about yourself in the ways that I outlined. Hot tip number 2, recognize that you were probably taught old garbage, hot garbage in graduate school. And that hot garbage is sometimes helpful, but often not helpful. So one of the things I love about my colleagues, I cannot praise them enough because they're good people and they're trying and they're smart and they know what they're doing, is I don't agree with them on everything. We're all different personality-wise. I know I'm not a number of their cup of teas, so to speak. But we all have the same attitude, which is basically something like, there's a knowledge base that is imperfect, and we need to be doing something about it as professionals in order to actually help our students become better clinicians and more scholar practitioners, like actual scholar practitioners. And so I respect what they're doing because they're actually doing the correct thing we're supposed to be doing, as opposed to many graduate schools, which are basically like seminary schools, where you're taught to be like a religious leader as opposed to a critical thinker who can show up in a professional relationship the right way. So that is my hot take about Mel's post. I like Mel. I think Mel is very bright. I think Mel also is super neurotic from what I can tell. But I think that's what makes her special and interesting. And that's super cool. So she is different than me. And I think she adds to the ecosystem that is therapy, Twitter, and all this stuff. So, all right, let's see what the comments are, because there's a lot of comments and I want to make sure I get to all of them. Let's see. Jake Moss said, how do you feel about the whole evidence-based treatment debate? I will come back to that in the next segment of this show, where I talk about ACEs, because ACEs is the perfect logical segue from where we were just at. Jonathan Cogburn says, I respect your willingness to continue to engage colleagues' ideas in spite of being blocked. Well, of course, yeah. It's just good luck, Jonathan, by the way, that I saw this, because I follow one of her friends who sometimes reposts what she says, and I think what she says is valuable. I think what she says often is valuable. Also, Jake Wiskerchin says, hello, hugs. Well, I hope Jake is well. I miss Jake. Corey says, sadly, most people will be lucky to get an average therapist. I think that the difference, the gap between being an average therapist and being a slightly above average therapist is not a giant gap. I think it's so easily doable to get just a little bit better and become more skilled in paying attention in therapy, in listening openly, and acknowledging your bias and understanding your countertransference. Like, these things are not wildly complicated at all times. And even if you're intellectually not the brightest, you can still pay attention on purpose without judgment. You can do the mindful thing. You can practice non-attachment. You can be aware of how your childhood stuff makes you sensitive to this group or that group or these kind of people or whatever it is. Like, that's not a giant ask, I think, Corey. So I think the average therapist is doing their best to be professionals and have a relationship that's helpful. That being said, I have all sorts of concerns about not only being midwits intellectually, but midwits in terms of self-awareness and countertransference and bias and things like that. So that is my bigger concern beyond even the intellect piece. But I do appreciate Mel for the grist for the mill, and I hope, Mel, you're doing well, genuinely. Club Exile says, as a former average barista, I would agree that being an average barista doesn't really kill people. The Dunning-Kruger tax, he says. It can be a risk anywhere. And I think that's true. I think that's basically fair, for sure. All right, so that is 2 posts down. The next post is going to be a little complicated. And so this is probably going to be the most boring and pedantic I can be today. And let me be clear that I don't mean to be boring and pedantic, but I think this is super important because this is one of those extremely, wildly, stupidly trendy things that I just wish would go away or get refined. Either go away or get refined, to be clear. So this is something I saw this morning, and I'm going to repost it real quick. Okay. So this morning, I saw a post from someone named Laura Corbeth. I do not know Laura. I don't believe that I've ever interacted with Laura before. I have no clue who she is or what she does and so on and so forth. And so, just like I said with Mel, I have no ill will here. It just is luck of the algorithm that it got tossed into my feed today and I saw it. So here we go. Here's what she said about a day ago. And there's a fancy infographic you can see on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at AlobhaPatrick. Okay. So here's what she said. This is the quote. She said, and I quote, "The ACE study showed us something important, childhood experiences matter, period. So does healing," with a leaf emoji. And then hashtag ACEs, hashtag trauma recovery. And so in the image, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I think she's just promoting her website. And God bless, promote your website for sure. She said the ACE study explained. I don't know which particular study she's referring to because it's not linked anywhere. So what the f are you talking about? Maybe link the study for us to read it. I don't know. So this is what the ACE study explained, so to speak. 67% of people had adverse childhood experiences. At least one ACE, adverse childhood experience. 1 in 8 people have 4 or more. So, a large chunk of the population has 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, which leads to a 4 to 11-fold increased risk of health problems, mental illness, and addiction. But there's hope. Healing is possible, which is true, by the way. And so let's talk about 2 different things. Let's talk about the fact that ACE is a garbage construct from the scientific perspective, from the perspective of psychometrics. And, as the post said, also, it is true that your childhood experiences will shape you to some degree. Now, I'm guessing, I don't know. I'm guessing people like Laura are fairly unaware of how personality is built and the heritability of different types of things. My guess is she understands very little about developmental trajectories in that she kind of has a normie take that ACEs are bad and adverse childhood experiences are basically the same thing as trauma, and the more trauma you have as a kid, the worse your life becomes. That's probably what she thinks. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So, is it true that your childhood experiences can shape the way that you show up in the world? Absolutely. Is it true that adversity in childhood can make your life worse, make it harder for you? Absolutely. Is it true that growing up in an impoverished neighborhood, or growing up with only maybe one parent, or growing up poor, or growing up with all sorts of obvious health issues makes your life harder and can even promote the development of mental illness? Absolutely. All of these things are real. Nothing about that is unreal. Now let's talk specifically about the concept of ACEs. So ACEs is this unfortunate thing that has become so popular in the last 8 years or something, and it's just hot garbage scientifically. So ACEs is an acronym, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So again, I've already acknowledged that adversity in childhood can hurt people, can predispose them to all sorts of problems. Generally, that makes all sorts of sense. Now let's talk about the pseudoscientific thing called ACEs. So there's the general view of this, and then there's ACEs. So the general view is adversity in childhood can hurt people. Sure, absolutely. That's the general view. The specific view of ACEs, specifically as measured by these questionnaires, we are going to talk about how this is such crap. So what I specifically said today, 6 hours ago, is this. The ACEs measure is one of the most psychometrically unsound, aka flawed, self-report measures ever created. It is absolute garbage from the point of view of the science of test construction. So, again, adversity in childhood, often bad. Sometimes people go through adversity and it makes their life better. That's true too. So there is post-traumatic growth and all these things, and there is resilience. That's a different podcast for a different day. But I will fully admit that Adversity, depending upon dozens of variables, can certainly hurt you and put you on a bad path. But it depends upon dozens of variables. It's not like the higher your ACEs score, the more screwed you are as a person. Which brings us to the critique of what ACEs actually are. So, I'm going to find, while we're talking right now, I'm going to go to Google Chrome and I'm going to find the very first ACEs measure we can. And I'm typing it into my phone as we speak, and I'm going to this organization, the very first one that shows up in the Google search, called acesaware.org. And I'm going to copy and paste this right now, live, and I'm going to post this right now. So you're going to be able to track in real time all the things that I'm saying, and you're going to know I'm not making shit up, just to be clear. Okay. So I'm doing this in real time. I didn't practice this. This is not something that I'm making up. This is completely a real thing that people use and care about. So this is the ACEs assessment measure from the ACEs Aware website. So I'm going to say just a couple of things before I go into criticizing this measure. Thing number one, when you're constructing a psychological test, if you look at the field of psychometrics, there's a really lengthy version of this discussion, but because this is a podcast for listeners of all backgrounds, I don't want to be too nerdy for anyone. But the short story is, when you're trying to assess for a given idea or construct, you try to create questions that directly get at that core construct. So if it's adverse childhood experiences, like adverse childhood trauma or something, you try to make it so that there's one single thing that correlates to this one single thing. So you try to create items that don't have multiple things in them. You don't create test questions that have multiple things in them. So one of the basic foundations of good test construction is not to add a bunch of ideas in one question that you're responding to, because it makes the thing more muddy and confusing and complicated for people, and people might respond more wildly. So let me explain why this measure is garbage. So this self-report measure about ACEs is 10 questions, and it's a yes-no thing. So the instructions are as written. Below is a list of 10 categories. These are categories of adverse childhood experiences. From the list below, please place a check mark next to each ACE category that you have experienced prior to your 18th birthday. Then please add up the number of categories of ACEs you experienced and put the total number at the bottom. So the instructions are clear. These are categories of adverse childhood experiences. They're not measuring the number of times these things happened. Just, did you experience something in this category is what this test is asking you. And there's 10 categories. Okay, so let's get into the actual questions. So number one, so this is considered adverse childhood experiences. Number one, did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you or take care of you? So I'm going to read the item again. And this is a yes-no question. Number one, did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you or take care of you? So I want to explain to you all the ways in which this is a ridiculous item from the point of view of test construction. So this is ridiculous for two reasons, two primary reasons. There are other reasons, but these are the two easiest to understand. Number one, in this category, you are confusing people to think that not having enough to eat is similarly to wearing dirty clothes, to similarly having no one to protect you or take care of you. I don't know about you all, but missing meals once in a while is probably not remotely the same thing as like my parents were gone for weeks on end and I was left alone in my filth. Missing a meal once in a while because I have like a single parent who is working their ass off, but we still didn't have enough money, but I respect that my parent was trying to make money, I think is a world of difference between that and like my parents are struggling with addiction and they're off getting high for 5 days at a time and I don't know where they are and shameless and all this stuff. Like, those are not the same thing at all. Those aren't remotely the same thing. So what the fuck are we assessing for here? Let me get to a different one that's problematic in a different way. Okay. Number 3, probably one of my most hated items on this test. Number 3, did you live with anyone who is depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? I'm going to read this again. Number 3, did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? So, for the people who are all about stigma and not stigmatizing mental illness, this is probably the most stigmatizing question I have seen on a self-report test in my career. And that's saying something because there's a lot of old measures that are real crap out there. So again, problem 1, this is stigmatizing all mental illness. What if you had a parent who was mentally ill who was doing great? Maybe they were in recovery and doing an awesome job. Maybe they were not super stressful because they actually had a handle on their mental illness. I don't know. Or maybe you saw your parents struggle with mental illness, and during that struggle, it didn't really hurt you, and then you saw them overcome, their mental illness, and as a result of overcoming their mental illness in front of you, you have more respect for them, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe there's a positive story out there, people's parents being mentally ill and overcoming it. So from the stigma perspective alone, that item is so fucked, and I can't believe it's actually on a test. Also, problem number 2 is the kind of, like, if you've ever seen Anchorman, there's a great meme from Anchorman. They get in a big fight, and they're all sitting in Ron's office after their fight, and they're like, boy, that escalated quickly. And that is literally what happened. I wish I had a producer who could put up the meme for me while I'm talking, because, like, holy shit. It went from, did you live with anyone in your home who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? Like, we went from had some anxiety, some PTSD that they couldn't manage, to like tried to kill themselves in front of you. Like, holy shit, dude, what are we doing here? So what I will say very clearly is that just these 2 items alone should invalidate this test because they're poorly constructed. They're conflating very different things that can have thousands of different impacts on a person depending upon dozens of context-based variables. Did your parents have mental illness? Maybe that hurt you. Maybe it helped you. Maybe it taught you a lesson about resilience. Maybe it both hurt you and helped you. So the idea that all these things are adverse in and of itself is false, number 1. Number 2, the idea that adversity itself is inherently a problem and toxic and causal of mental illness is bullshit. Because adversity also helps people. Now, I'm not some loser conservative who's like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not me. What I am is a person who's like, okay, if we look at the full picture, the whole list of variables, did the adversity you experienced mostly help you, mostly hurt you, or was it kind of a mix? Because all 3 possibilities exist for all people. And you cannot know at what point your childhood stuff mostly hurt you, mostly help you, or some kind of mix until you're actually out of childhood. It's impossible to predict that. We can't know. We don't have good data for that purpose. So what the holy fuck is this measure? This thing is such horseshit, in my opinion. This is psychometrically speaking absolute garbage. And there are 2 of 10 items that should just be thrown into the garbage bin or remade very seriously. Another version. This is the 3rd item. I'll only go through one more for time's sake. Number 9. Another one that I just can't understand and make sense of. Number 9, and I quote, did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were special? So again, we are conflating not feeling fundamentally cared about or not feeling special. Those aren't the same thing. Those actually, believe it or not, those actually aren't even remotely the same thing. Because being loved, being basically fundamentally safe and important, is not the same thing as being special. So again, from the point of view of psychometrics, which is the scientific study of how psychological tests are constructed, like IQ tests and symptom inventories and depression measures and all these things, about half of these items are garbage, hot garbage. And so the idea that your ACEs score actually means something specific about you is absurd, because these test questions don't actually speak to a fundamental reality about your life when you were a kid. Did your parent or other adult in the home often swear at you? Well, what does often mean? Does that mean they swore at you once a week, once a month? Or does that mean that you had a 1-year period where your mom or your dad was really sick and swearing at you, but the other 17 years were pretty good and they got their shit taken care of and figured themselves out? Like, this is such a poorly designed measure from the point of view of psychometrics that it should be laughed out of any graduate program. But so many programs think ACEs is the bee's knees because we feel compassionate about childhood trauma. It's like, this is not a measure of childhood trauma. This is a measure of adversity. If this was supposed to be a trauma questionnaire, they would use the childhood trauma questionnaire, for instance, the CTQ. That's a different measure. And that thing has different life outcomes, like the life events questionnaire. That's a different kind of questionnaire. Or the PCL-5. Like, there's so many different things that are more psychometrically sound that could have been used, but instead people love this thing. I think this thing was created by nurses or public health people. And public health people are just so not helpful, usually. So here's what I will say in summary now that I have ranted for a series of minutes about this. And then I'll get to the chat here. So let's be super duper clear that what I said at the beginning of this rant is true at the beginning and at the end of this rant. And this is exactly what I teach my students when I have them evaluate it and them critique it. They figure it out, not me. I don't bias them at all. I sit there quietly and let them critique it. They're like, oh shit, this is garbage. So here's the truth. What I said at the beginning of this is what I will absolutely say at the end of this. At the beginning, I said, adversity in childhood can hurt people and set them on a bad path. Yes, that is true in a very general way. But we cannot know definitively the ways in which childhood adversity actually hurt people, number one. Number two, hurt people in such a way that it sets them on the path towards addiction or PTSD or crappy relationships or whatever. We don't have good enough ideas and refined enough constructs to actually be able to assess that accurately and predict it accurately, because the human mind and relationships are way too complicated. You would need trillions of data points to create the correct regression equation to predict that effectively. So we can't literally do that. So yes, childhood adversity, often very bad. For some people, toxic. For some people, tragic. For other people, childhood adversity, not toxic, not tragic, sometimes even helps them and shapes them in the direction of becoming a healthier, more adaptive, more functional person. So to remind people, this is not the lame-ass conservative talking point of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and get over it and rub some dirt in it. Rub some dirt in your childhood trauma. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying specifically is this very broad measure and this construct that people masturbate about in graduate programs and public health departments is garbage. The concept itself is garbage. The basic idea that childhood adversity can hurt people is true. This concept, garbage. Basic idea, true. I hope that difference makes sense because I've said it like 7 times now. I'm sure this will get clipped and I will get fired. And God bless, because then we have a good lawsuit on our hands. But like the real truth is It's super crystal clear. If you're a competent clinician, you try to help people understand their experiences in childhood and help them learn to make sense of it and manage it and tolerate it so that it doesn't have a hold over their life. Sometimes childhood adversity can be sometimes helpful, sometimes it's super toxic and dangerous. But we can't know that, and there's no ACEs score that perfectly predicts that. Because some people who have a family member who's very mentally ill, it makes them stronger as kids. It might hurt them a little bit, but it might help them more than it hurts them. Who knows? Nobody knows, as Nate Bargatze says, as George Washington. That was quite the rant. ACEs, just absolute garbage. So, let's go to the chat because I've missed a bunch of things. Jonathan says, Megan, Patrick, and I had a great DM discussion about your exact point earlier today. Yep. Megan says, once in a beginning of the year district meeting, they made all the teachers take the ACE inventory and get into circles of trust to cry. Oh, dear sweet baby Jesus, how stupid is that? If you're a principal, if you're a high school superintendent or something, please do not make your teachers take the ACEs measure and get in a circle and cry. That's a terrible idea. For dozens of reasons, you can hire me for a really reasonable fee, and I'll help you create something far better and less toxic to your staff. Jonathan has a number of comments. My concern, Jonathan says, is that educators have no means for dealing directly with past events in their classroom because educators aren't therapists. So, as Jonathan says, so it more often results in paralysis for the educator about imagined student fragility. Excuse me. So just to speak to Jonathan's point, some students are rather vulnerable and rather fragile. They experience all sorts of oppression and trauma and shame. They grow up in chaos and uncertainty, and that is a very different problem, and those people deserve help. And some people do not, and conflating them is a terrible idea. As Jonathan just said, that can lead to overprotectiveness and overfunctioning, which can be very toxic to kids too. Overprotectiveness and underprotectiveness appear to be toxic for kids. So there must be this secret third thing, back to the Goldilocks and Three Bears metaphor, of just the right amount, which we don't know. Jonathan says, damn, Patrick is maybe more pissed about this topic than I am on average, which is saying something. Very spicy entertainment, that's for sure. You ever want to get me worked up, get me talking about ACEs? Club Exile says, that's loser conservatism. That's absolutely loser conservatism. And that can be very adverse to a narcissist. Absolutely. Corey says, super broad strokes in some of these questions. Yes, exactly, Corey. That's a huge problem. It's not a very specific test. That's why it's garbage. Also, the obsession with making mental health scalable down to a brief questionnaire, also terrible, right? He said similar to the obsession with the GAD-7 and the PHQ-9. Absolutely. Club Exile asks a very good question, which I should probably start a Patreon so I can get paid for these questions. Club Exile says, but I'm always happy to answer your questions, sir. Is there a difference anymore between resilience and loser conservatism? Yes, I hope so, because there are such a thing as good conservatives who are not trying to tell everyone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I think there are probably some reasonable adults in the room who don't think like that. Corey says, the problem with what you're saying is that it's nuanced and requires careful assessment. Yes, Corey, I know. That is the problem. I am not rich and famous because I am trying to be nuanced. And then all the hacks on TED Talks are not trying to be nuanced. They're trying to have a hot take that is so simple and digestible, it might as well be high fructose corn syrup. Corey says, there's a fixation with making mental health something that can be quickly assessed and fixed. And you cannot fix mental health, by the way, because that implies that your mind is broken and your brain is not broken. If you have a mental illness, your brain is not broken. Just so you know. Club Exile says, I never needed to deal with the students' past events when I was a teacher. I was there to educate, and their past had little to do with that. I mean, usually it does. Sometimes mental health issues and trauma and things like that make it harder to be an educator. Not Laws 2 says, can I help my friend Jeff with loser conservatism? I don't know that I can, because I think it depends upon what exactly loser, what kind of loser he is. And I don't think he is a loser based upon my experiences with him. So that's just my hot take. So I actually had one more post to talk about, but we are out of time, unfortunately. So I will talk about my friend. He's not my friend. Someone I appreciate and respect, Jonathan Shedler, next week on the podcast. And he has a really interesting quote that I want to talk about. So be on the lookout for Jonathan Shedler next week. So a lot was said today, and a lot of great chat in the comments today. So first and foremost, let me thank everyone who showed up to chat today, because without y'all here in the chat, it's not the same. Like, I can certainly rant, but ranting isn't the same as discussing. And so having an actual discussion makes everything better. So thank you very much for coming to chat. And thank you for all the reposts and things like that, because getting the word out, getting a critical voice that's reasonable out. I don't sound very reasonable right now because I'm a little worked up and a little caffeinated. But genuinely speaking, I want people to be harmed less and helped more. That's the whole point of UnShrink Me, because shrinks are these hacks who are narcissists. And I don't want the hacks who are narcissists to hurt people, right? And so that's why I criticize the ACEs measure. And that is why I criticize Nick Tabor for his takes and things like that, because I respect these people. I respect these ideas, but I don't respect how they can harm people. And so in the service of helping people more, that's why I created this podcast. So please like, share, and subscribe. Get the word out so we can get more people in the discussion. Amanda, you just got here. New here, just got here while you're saying goodbye. I'm so sorry that we missed each other. Thank you for showing up, Amanda. Next week, I'll be live on Saturday at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I hope to see you again next time. There's so many episodes you can check out on my YouTube channel, The Psychology Checkup. So please get the word out. Get more people here in the chat, because the more people that are here in the chat, the more we can expand on things and be even more nuanced to help people. Not because I'm a nuance bro, but because reality is mental health, whatever that means, is not simple. To be helpful to people means to actually treat people seriously and respectfully. And when you respect people, you see their complexity. You see the layers of their life. Like I said earlier, for some people, adversity makes their life way worse, whereas other people's childhood adversity makes them better in all this stuff. And so that is the point of this podcast. And so thank you to everyone who showed up here today and chatted and commented. Thank you for everyone who shared this on Twitter. I really appreciate you. And as always, I like to end this podcast with a joke. And so if it's okay with you all, I'll go just a little bit over and we can try this therapy joke for today. Okay? So please like, share, and subscribe. Please come back next Saturday at 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And without further delay, here is today's joke. So, I once had this patient. This patient had a disorder that we call pyromania. And if you've never heard of pyromania is a disorder where you are kind of like, just to summarize it, kind of like addicted to setting fire to things. You get, like, there's an intense pressure before you set something on fire, and then like there's like a tension and release, and it's like an orgasmic release of sorts for some people to set things on fire. And so I had this patient who had a diagnosis of pyromania. And it was an interesting case because this young man wasn't interested in like setting things on fire for fun per se, but he was just obsessed with setting things on fire. So when I met him for our first session, I said, "What exactly do you like? What does it feel like to set things on fire?" And he said to me, "You know what? I don't know that I like setting things on fire. There's just this initial spark that happens when you set things on fire, and it's super bright and like it kind of shines in my eyes, and I kind of like that feeling. And then once the fire kind of dies down, I'm kind of bored. And so I just have to light another match and light another match and light another match." I'm like, "Okay, gotcha." I said, where are you doing this? He said, well, I'm doing it in my basement. And so we spent the first session talking about, what to do to be safe and harm reduction of sorts so he doesn't burn his house down. Second session, he comes back. He's like, yeah, I did it even more this week since I last saw you. Okay, so you're setting more fires this past week. That's probably not a good sign. So we should probably talk about maybe, are there alternatives to setting things on fire? Can we, get some flint and steel and wool and like set fires that way? Can we do something else to create a spark experience? And we spent the entire session talking about, why he likes to set fires and the spark thing and all this stuff. And at the end of the session, we didn't really come up with a good alternative. Excuse me. And so I wasn't feeling very optimistic about how our work was going to go. And so he came back for the third session and he said, Dr. Lockwood, you're never going to believe it. This week, I didn't set one fire. I said, wow, you didn't set any fires this week? What happened? He said, well, I was thinking about the idea that the spark is what I like. I said, okay, so what did you do with that thought? He said, well, I got a super high intensity LED flashlight. And I started to basically light the flashlight instead of setting a fire. I said, that's super smart. That makes sense. He goes, yeah. And what I found out was, as much as I like the bright spark thing, the lighting of the spark, this flashlight is so literally intense that I can't actually stand it for more than a second or so. And so I actually have been doing that flashlight thing even less over the last week. And I don't even feel much of an urge to set a fire anymore. I said, wow, you kind of cured yourself in a week. That's pretty amazing. He says, what do you think about my insight there? And I said, sounds like a pretty bright idea to me. All right, I'll catch you all next week. Please take good care of yourselves. Take care of the people in your life. Have good food. Have good sex. Make sure you move. Make sure you sleep. I will catch it all very, very soon. Bye-bye.